And there it is. Okay, welcome everyone. I expect, as usual, we'll probably have a few late stragglers come in, but I'd love to start the conversation now and honor all of our time here today. So, as you know, today's theme is money, and actually, many of you I've met in other steps moments, but just in case you don't know who I am, I'm Esther, and I feel very lucky to be a part of the stewarding team this year for our little collective. Um, we have a few ways that we wanted to start this conversation before we dove right in. As money is a big topic, and it would be nice to build a bit of a container and to talk about why myself and Martin are here to talk about it with you all. So I thought a good place to start would be first and foremost if we could come up with a bit of a definition, at least for ourselves in this group. So if you are able, I know there's a few people on phones and tablets, if you're able to complete the sentence in the chat, money is, take a second to think. Money is an enabler of choice. Welcome, Maggie. Money is a necessary method of exchange within the capitalist system we are stuck in. Money makes the world go round, right? Money is representation of value. Money is freedom or responsibility or a curse. For those just joining, if you want, we're completing the sentence in the chat. Fiona and Happy, money is a translation mechanism. Money is amplified creative freedom, whether we like it or not. Cool. Thank you for all of that. I will, someone wants to describe money as an exchange of energy. Yes, interesting. I'm excited to hear more about why you disagree with this. I also will drop a very classic definition of money into the chat, which I got from John. So both he can share the responsibility and we also don't have to run with it. But money is also a medium of exchange, on what we are exchanging, a measure of value, a standard of deferred payment, and a store of value. So as we launch into our conversation, you'll probably hear me say this a few times, but there's a lot of complexity around money and how it appears into our lives and why we care about it. Welcome, Fiona. Good to have you with us. We're just sort of settling in and getting started. But why are we having this conversation? And particularly why are Martin and I interested in this? So we wanted to do a little bit of that framing as well. I'll go ahead and start and then I'll hand it to Martin. Very basically, I thought that I wanted to have this conversation with others. It's a topic that is frequently intertwined in my life, but I never get to really talk about it head on, specifically in the regenerative space. And as I am normally working with climate activists and climate entrepreneurs who are trying to make money work in a system that feels against them, money feels like a really important conversation for us to continue to have as best that we can. And so I'm interested in finding ways to have complex conversations quickly and what kind of foundations are useful and what kind of tools are useful. So we have a tool that we might share with you, but also looking forward to hearing what type of tools and navigating compasses you all have found in your experiences and in your practices to handle and grapple with this topic of money. And I'll hand it to Martin.
Beautiful. Thank you, Esther. And also thank you everybody for including me into this wonderful community today. Just a little bit of background on who I am before I talk exactly why money is interesting, because I think they're quite related. So my background's in startups and systems change. I spent about 5-ish years at a regenerative sort of sustainability and circular economy organization called Metabolic, which some of you might be familiar with. I've also co-founded my own organization in the past, which I have shut down over the last half year. And now I'm basically splitting my time between a biotech startup that is fundraising and a systemic investing fund in democracy that is providing financing. So I'm here today because this topic is quite close to me. I've had to make some difficult personal decisions because of money. I've had to make a lot of weird and difficult decisions professionally because of money. And as Esther said, I do think that it's a hard topic that should be talked about. So I'm very jazzed about it. And it's really important to me to now understand, how other people in our movement talk and think and feel about money. So very excited to be here, and I'm arriving with probably more questions than answers, but I think that's a good way to arrive as well.
Awesome. Thanks, Martin. Um, Much of today's conversation will be structured around storytelling. So know that there will be a moment if you felt called to talk also about your reasons for being here and what is interesting to you. Um, Before we dive into that, I would love to read the words. So for those of us who are new to the Steps Collective, we have a set of words that we try to read to kind of ground each of our conversations, whether they be online or in person, whether they be about money or renewal, um, and really are co-crafted. I'm going to read the original ones, but there's been many different versions, so much so that we even riffed on them last time in Emergence. So feel free to lean back, close your eyes, whatever that looks like, and I can read them here. Show the easy place to start. As we navigate these transitional times and traverse the emerging regenerative territory, we commonly find that there is not always an obvious path to follow. With many questions to navigate, yet no single answer to guide us, we look for the footprints of others to consider where we might take our next steps. However, even the most experienced travelers in these spaces would admit they are continually finding their way. Unsure of what is around the next bend or over the next peak, this is an ongoing dance with uncertainty, switching between action and inspiration, acting before we think too much, and thinking before we go too far. So although taking the first or next step can often feel like the hardest, know that you are not walking alone. Whether or not your own trail will become a valuable path for others doesn't matter. We help each other towards a regenerative tomorrow, not as experts, but as parents, neighbors, colleagues, citizens, question askers. All our stories are unique, and all our voices are welcome. There are many paths up the same mountain. So welcome to the few of us that have also joined as we've started to build up the container of our space for this next 50 minutes. For those who really have just joined, know that you haven't missed too much. We've just done a bit of introductions, read some words for why Steps Collective is here. And now we'd love to kind of interactively understand a bit more about you all. So I know that there are some folks on phones and iPads, so this might be a bit of a moment, but I don't think we have any non-video participants in, but if you can find anybody's or your own actually is better. Oh, actually here, give me 2 seconds. I've just been on Google Meets. Sorry. If you go to view, always changing the view. So this is where you would switch to multi-speaker or speaker. It's usually in the top right corner of your Zoom, and click on hide non-video participants. So that means that now you shouldn't be able to see me. Is that true? So now turn your cameras off. And what we'll do next is just a little bit of what we have as a Step In With Me activity, but online. So when I say a statement, if that statement resonates with you, or you agree with it, or you have experienced it, you can turn your camera on. So we'll try our first one. Turn your camera on if your mindset has changed over time about money. Nice. So shifting paths, not always the same experience. Okay, so cameras off. We'll do it again. Turn your camera on if you spoke about money with your family or guardians as a child or teenager or young adult. Okay. Okay. Welcome. Turn your cameras back off. Um, Turn your camera on if money, the lack of it, the management of it, the distribution of it is a frequent pressure in your workplace. Okay. Some of us thinking about this, it's in our lives. It's a frequent conversation. Great. Just a few others. So cameras off. And turn your camera on if you may avoid looking at your bank account or planning out financials because money feels a bit like a boogeyman. Yeah. Yep. I see you too. I see you. And last but not least, turn your camera on if you weren't sure about coming to this talk because the words money and regeneration didn't feel like something that fit into those same space or place. I thought about that. Sorry, great. Everyone can turn their cameras on. Um, so we wanted to just situate ourselves and knowing that there's a lot of commonalities around money and our experiences, but also many differences and many ways that we are coming to this conversation. There may be some apprehension in the room. There might be some concerns about what this conversation brings up for you personally. So, an invitation to only participate as much as you want. Know that this is absolutely a casual conversation and that there will be many, many, many different ways in which this conversation will go. Um, One thing that we want to encourage is just speaking from the I. Money in can often be something that we talk about in we's and in you's and in us, but our experiences of money are often very personal. So where possible, speaking from your own personal experience is always most best. Okay, so that's been a lot of me talking. We wanted to build this container because we also wanted us to have a rich conversation as best we can. Um, we have been thinking a lot about paradoxes. Maybe I'll toss it to Martin to just say a little bit more about our thinking there, and then we'd love to open up to you all with a question.
Yeah, absolutely. I think the best way to start this is actually uh, framing it how what we were saying ahead of the call, which is previously we were saying that money often comes with a couple of sort of elephants in the room, but really when you think about it, they're more so paradoxes in how we need to live and how we need to survive in our existing system and how it relates to wanting to transform and wanting to regenerate while also being in an existing system. And so Esther and I were thinking through a couple of different paradoxes that we were seeing. And Esther, I'm trying to think about what would be the best way to make it a little bit more collaborative rather than just like reading them off. But we were thinking of maybe putting a little bit of a heartbeat on some of these paradoxes, just to see, if the group resonates. And then after that, breaking out into a little bit more of a conversation to figure out, are any of these paradoxes things that resonate, that cause a lot of tension in our lives, either personally or professionally? And also, what sort of other paradoxes exist? And I'll give an example. So, one of the things that we were talking about was that regenerative projects need capital, but often the capital that is required demands returns that undermines that regeneration. So a lot of capital that goes into projects creates return sort of profiles or expectations that undermine the concept of wanting to regenerate, wanting to sustain, because they often, these sort of return profiles hit at sort of embedded growth, and often it's inorganic growth, right? So think like investing into something and expecting it to, deliver an insane market level return when you're actually just doing something that is not meant to grow infinitely, like a cancer. The second one that we were talking about is that Regeneration values the intangible, while capitalism oftentimes values the measurable. And trying to hold that in a way, and trying to realize the fact that we live in a system that, for example, anchors on GDP and anchors on financial sort of metrics. Yet the things that are arguably the most valuable in our lives are actually the intangibles, the ones that you can't put into a container and put sort of value to as well. Esther, do you want to jump in? Because I also I'm trying to figure out how to do this in a way that is a little bit more interactive, if you know what I mean.
I'd throw it back to the group. Are there any other paradoxes that you all are coming with, or as you hear these examples that you think of in your work or your lives, or more broadly the world? We'd be interested. We have a few more, but we'll leave it to you all.
I'm happy to throw in an example. It's one that Hardeep actually threw at me a couple of nights ago. Literally, we were discussing a futures project that I'm working on, like a workshop sort of simulation game design, and it's around the future of parenting. And there's a paradox around care for each other not being valued in the economy at all. Well, it's actually, I think, one of the most important jobs in the world. And on the other side, there's this question of yeah, but because it is so important, we shouldn't commodify it, because you should surely not commodify care, which is an act of love. So yeah, I'll just leave that paradox there because I don't really have the answer.
Sharing it around.
I probably won't explain this very well, but in the work that I've seen with, say, NGOs and charities, there's a reason for those organizations to exist and to have a permanent or semi-permanent way of pushing back at a particular thing. But over time, the need to sustain that level of organization and the money involved in it becomes sometimes the more important than actually the mission that they're there to serve.
Good. I think I have one from the kind of voluntary meetup group that I run in design, which is you need more money, then you need to break even to break even. Yeah. If that makes sense. So basically, your running costs, you should be able to just have what you could to break even, but in fact you need more than what you need to break even to cover taxes and basic running costs. So it's just this weird paradox.
Yeah. I think one that I struggle with quite personally, especially now as I think about the future and what I want to do with my life, is around having kids and around trying to raise kids by providing via, having money and being able to pay for their education and their housing and their food. Whereas also many times making that money comes with essentially destroying their future. And that really hits home quite a bit for me, because I sometimes doubt having a child was always something that I wanted, but now I feel bad because the methods to do that in our existing system almost feel threatening to their very future, if that makes sense.
So to hear that.
A loop with that, Martin, if I may, with what Isabel described. Been having a ongoing commentary with my wife for a number of years of being individuals who can't have children, and that the way that work, like capitalist commercial pressures, have changed the dynamic of the family unit for most nations, capitalist nations at least, has meant that the care loop that existed, which was that we raise children, and at some point in doing that, we're looking after them. There is a tip where we become the people that need to be looked after, and our children step in to close that loop. If you don't have those children, who looks after you? And we've been sort of exploring those concepts of the traditional like communal or like clan-like models that we have eradicated from our existence and the complexities that they're creating, and then the subsequent industries that emerge to compensate for something that we were actually quite capable of doing for a very, very long time.
Yeah. Very complete. I saw that there was a few paradoxes in the chat as well around promoting sustainable business practices when we're unable to make a living or sustainable living from offering those services. Also around time scales, right? So how are we, John says, the typical payback on investors in venture capital is 10 years. How can we create something that scales and impacts and is valuable in a really short period of time? Another paradox. Right. Any others that resonate? So we're seeing also this intertwining, right, between the personal and the professional, knowing that often capital and money is intertwined with the way that we are valued in our workplace, but then often challenge ourselves in how we personally see our lives growing or scaling, or what those community structures look like, as Andy was speaking to. Yeah, I'll call it. Any other paradoxes, maybe one or two?
Not so much a paradox as just to say that I was nodding furiously along to all of those with my video had to go off and then my connection broke down. But I just, a lot of the things that are on my mind have been covered, including both sides of that, children or no children. As someone who doesn't have children and has arrived at the conclusion that I don't think I will. I also have the privilege of being a male, of that feeling, being like something of a choice. But having been on and seeing all my friends on both sides of that we're in a world that is being optimized in a way that doesn't allow for the raising of children. Certainly in where I am right now, it's been optimized against the raising of children, but also against feeling fully involved in life if you don't have to.
Thanks, Chris.
Does anybody have any specific stories relating to some of these paradoxes that they'd like to bring forth? I can also maybe speak to one that I often saw. It wasn't necessarily aired here, but like when I was at Metabolic, I noticed that we had a really, really talented team that was initially attracted by the mission, but once they stayed with the organization for several years, they almost faced this problem or this tension point between wanting to stay at the organization to continue to create impacts, or moving on to other organizations that could pay 3, 4, 5 times more. And this is something that ultimately led us to lose some of our best people, because that tension over time gets to people. It is like a constant pressure around, okay, I might be making my choice and pursuing work that I have, but then it's at the detriment of my family's future and our financial sort of situation as well. And this one was really hard to sort of rectify as we were navigating, also building a team and keeping a team afloat. Not sure if that resonates with anybody.
that has just made something. I'm sitting opposite a building site, and I come from a background, as some of you here know, in architecture, and architecture as in construction architecture, designing buildings. And a thing I've noticed within the construction sector, which, whether we like it or not, there is construction that needs to be done, whether we think it's something done in the right way or not, those who are closer to the money and understand the money, there's a correlation between those who are closer to the money, looking at it closer, understand it closer, who make more of it, who get more value out of it, than those who actually maybe have a craft or skilled. I've seen so many people so chronically undervalued while making so much because they don't, they're not money people. And I include a lot of architects in that.
I think everyone that works in creative industries could quite comfortably sit in that. I think it's something that takes a very long time in your career to learn and understand what it actually is that you're doing, because whatever you think it is, it's not that. Related
so
to that, I think that there's the thing that I struggle with the most, and I don't think that there is a single entity in the world that does not encounter this paradoxical thinking, is I don't think anyone that owns businesses actually wants to invest in its people capabilities anymore. And if you look at the challenges in the global job market, there's a desire to only hire people who already know how to do the thing that you sell. And yet they're very expensive as a result. So you try to find ways of being able to make that cheaper, which invariably means these concepts of nearshoring and offshoring, because someone else's economy is more profitable than yours, which has its own problems. But ultimately, if you actually recognize traditional norms of like business, of having people who are just starting their careers, therefore are cheaper, but invest in developing them, then you would theoretically address the problem. But that takes time, and I don't think anyone cares about that.
Yeah, Mish.
Commenting on what you've just said, Andy, there's a recent report that came out from McKinsey in the States, and they had analyzed the success of various different very large organizations in America and found that the ones that are currently at the top of their game in their sector is organizations like Unilever and so on. The ones who are doing the best are the ones who are actually investing in their talent rather than seeing it as an operating expense. So when they are doing that, their productivity increases, well-being, business bottom line, all of these things. It seems counterintuitive for most businesses, though, because they see it as a cost. They see it as, an expense rather than something that they should actually be nurturing. So there is an argument and there is proof that this would work if businesses would think about what you're suggesting. But unfortunately, most of them don't, because of the system that we're stuck in at the moment and trying to change.
I'd be curious to hear if there are any personal experiences navigating this at a smaller scale. I think for me, I often, and thank you for sharing this, Mitch, because I think those are the fuel that reminds me, okay, this is possible. We're thinking about this. We have language and we have data and we have the words to say, why aren't we valuing work and valuing time? But then it's very difficult when I bring it to a smaller scale and I say, okay, well, how do we do that, right? Like, what does that look like if I were to bring that to my organization or to my communities? And I'd be curious, as I'm also saying in the chat, bubble up if there are personal experiences, and feel welcome to not say exact organizations or names, be as confidential as you need, but any personal stories of finding a path through navigating some of these paradoxes in your own personal lives, whether it be at work or through personal decision making or local community gardens. wherever those types of choices are happening. Yeah, Doug.
The only space I've found where this kind of stuff works in a way that doesn't feel forced, or that we're trying to retrofit an ideology to a system which has its dominant way of operating, is in the co-op sector, because cooperatives, of which I'm part of one, are explicitly designed to create a whole new economic sector where you prefer to work with other cooperatives. So it is inherently anti-capitalist, and people roll their eyes. I'm sure not as many people here will roll their eyes, but people roll their eyes when you say, like, the problem is capitalism. But the problem is capitalism, and the problem is the kind of dominant ideology that we're forced to live within. The problem with AI is not the technology, it's the capitalist ideology that underpins it. The problem with half the stuff is in the chat and the people have talked about is the fact that the dominant ideology is extractive of labor. And so centering and foregrounding human value through the work that we do, to my mind, starts and ends by people owning the organizations of which they are part. And that can be in a very hands-on way with a very small organization where you're doing the books and you're responsible for bringing the business. It can also be in a much bigger scale where you have ownership of a business that you are part of, which is huge, like the John Lewis Partnership or much larger co-ops. So that's the only space where I've seen this kind of stuff work. That isn't like, oh, well, now let's turn our organization into a B Corp.
I'll quickly tag a handle of someone on Substack for those of you on Substack who is completely devoted to this kind of regenerative living cooperatives, but in a really quite forward-thinking, energized way, and is building a bit of a community around that. She's called Jay Friday, so I'll put that in the chat. I thought you might be interested.
I can maybe share a story that I always thought was pretty funny, and this clashing sort of approach between co-ops and also people rolling their eyes. So a couple of years ago, I had some friends in Amsterdam pull together their skills, and they basically built a financial plan, designed a whole architectural plan, and built their own cooperative building on a piece of land outside of Amsterdam. And they built a really interesting financial model where essentially everybody would pay in for about 20 years into a trust below Amsterdam's sort of average rents. And then they would have like the sense of ownership into the trust, and they would have the right to live into the co-op for the rest of their lives if they wanted to. It gets more nuanced than that, but those are the basics. But the interesting part about it is my friend was actually presenting this to a group of sort of real estate experts in the Netherlands trying to deal with the housing crisis. And he brought this model up, and one of the people on call called him out and said, I've been in the real estate industry for the last 30 years. Like, this is not possible. What you've done, I know the numbers, and I know for a fact that what you're telling is a lie. And my friend said, okay, well, come next Monday to our office. I will open the books to you and I'll show you the model. And when the person showed up, they looked at the model and they're like, well, yeah, when you take out the profit margin, it's possible. And it was like, well, yeah, this is the point, because the way that you view this is extractive. Of course, it's not possible. And this to me was always like this really interesting example of not only in housing, but in all of the basic necessities that we have, including food, including also a whole assortment of things. What happens when you take out that profit margin, and what sort of new possibilities could exist?
I think that's really interesting, because I think that all of these things suffer from a logical conflict I don't think anyone goes in with the intention of, and that is the concept of appreciation and depreciation in value being attributed to a dollar sign. So that the issue with that is like, you look at any house. So like, I'm sat in a house right now that probably cost less than £20,000 to build in 1930. And in 10 years' time, who knows, maybe it's worth like £1 million. It's actually still worth the £20,000 that were invested in the bricks in the first place. Like, it shouldn't be able to grow in value, like a monetary value. Like, if things just stayed as being, a banana is a banana, then maybe you can find that balance. Maybe that's actually where the money, like, paradox occurs. It's because the value of it has always been tied to something of scarcity, like a finite thing, and the whole sort of introduction of fiat broke that model, and it's made it even harder for being able to comprehend it.
Yeah, it seems like lots of money problems would more or less go away I mean, this is a very London perspective, which is obviously ridiculous. It's one of the most ridiculous in the world. But if housing and trains weren't so expensive, most of our money issues would become a lot simpler. And it seems like these how we've allowed these markets to completely run rogue has really ruined a lot of and it has broken the links between like work and what pays, and that, like, the decoupling between value and work, like that whole discussion. I don't know if you've seen it go around in the last few weeks. It's very big in the future space now, but there's a lot of that concept of, like, there's a whole groups and groups of young people who are just unsubscribing from the whole idea of working because it's obviously not worth it anymore, and they'll just go and do their own thing. But that whole trajectory of the career doesn't pay. So that's breaking the system. And then lots of people who are further on in their careers see that their expertise has become obsolete or is not valued in the same way anymore, and it doesn't pay in the same way anymore. They can't find the jobs that value what they can actually contribute. So that's all these. Yeah, sorry, I'm rambling a bit, but it seems like all these systems are breaking in so many ways. I remember.
I'm no good at keeping lists, and I can't type it on my phone. So I'm going to probably forget some of these things. But further, what Bella just said about the young people, I heard someone comment recently that we're returning to the Jane Austen days where you no longer marry someone for their job, you marry them for their inheritance. I can't remember where I heard it recently, and that's certainly a British thing. There's also something I read recently, which is talking about the percentage of money that people have tended to spend on food historically, the percentage of your income that went on to food, which is significantly higher than we have come to expect. And yes, our housing is now absurdly high percentage of our costs. But actually, it's like, is that because it's gone up, or is it because the cost of food, cost of consumption has gone down? Where is that sort of balance? Where has that come into it? And then the other thing is actually, as Andy was talking about the house and its value, I'm worried I'm going to sound. I'm worried this is a Marxist thing. Could be. Just tell me if it is, or start me if it is. But I struggle with using the word value in terms of how much something costs in terms of money. I tend not to use that word. So when you say a house is valued at that, well, that's not the value at it. That's the monetary cost. I know. I don't know why I draw that distinction, but it is that thing of money is a way of measuring some value, but it is not value. And I don't know if I'm wrong in that, but it's just that's. Yeah.
No, we don't like, value and cost is not the same thing at all. There's that brilliant book that came out, what, 10, 15 years ago, that calculated the real value of like a burger, which would, if you'd actually calculate the real cost of a burger, would cost you over $200. a piece, because we do not value nature. We do not value the time. We do not value all the labor that's gone into it. We do not value the
we don't
animals that
value
we
it
kill.
economically. We now only value what we value economically, or our culture does, whereas historically economic value is
That's broken.
yeah.
Something
Sorry to say that.
something that because I would love to also share a tool and maybe spend some time looking at it as well. But this conversation about value is really interesting, and you know what I've experienced in both my own career, but also in the way that I've worked with others beyond the meta of value, right? How do we value these larger systems? When we apply that language of value not as an extractive, monetized word, but as something that we want to exchange, right? So we put value on things that we want to exchange, whether that's our time, maybe it's our relationships. So, we might be in a position where we don't have the financial capital to be exchanging in something, but we might have the social capital. We know people, or whoever just mentioned the Jane Austen, we're marrying for a house. I think that's an extreme, but also like, where do we have material capitals? For example, maybe we're working and living in a cooperative where there's space for people to gather. And so I've been thinking a lot about this value exchange. As some of you may know, I also often work with volunteers. And I think that's something that we see a lot in the regenerative space, and its predecessor of sustainability is volunteerism. And how are people engaging in wanting to be a part of making change, right? So as much as we are overwhelmed by the monetization of it, there are still many people lining up wanting to participate in change work and seeing that happen. And they're often giving their time for free. And so how are we as organizations or as holders of a diverse amount of capital, understanding the ways in which folks are valuing what they have to exchange? Because often the only exchange that we're experiencing is in financial terms. And I want to just share, I'll share also a link to this, but I want to share if I can find it. Something that I've found really useful in my work. Has anybody here heard of the resilient wealth framework? No? Okay.
Please share it.
Yeah. Can you see my screen? Can someone give me a thumbs up? Yeah, okay, cool. I keep saying this every time I share it to people, that I hope one day someone makes this look better. It's not my diagram, but it's as good as we're going to get. And so yeah, so something I've been thinking about in my personal practice as someone who wants to operate regeneratively and who really values and uses a language of abundance and reciprocity, because I think that these words, we can talk about the systems that money create that get complicated and people become academics in, but also just in my own personal life, I'm trying to say, okay, how do I engage with these concepts in a way that feels authentic to my own experience, having had, various financial troubles in the past and navigated a working class upbringing, but also had the blessing of privilege and being able to be around a lot of spaces where money exists and money does flow. Yeah, so thinking about where we value capital and where capital sits in our own lives, and not only focusing on our financial capital, but also thinking about this broader spectrum of where capital can be. And within that, also helping our organizations and ourselves and others think about where they value, right? Because I might look at this and say, okay, I know where my social capital is. I know where my material capital is. I know where my natural capital is. But I've done a lot of work to discover that and to think about it and to try to find a balance in my personal practice. And when I then step into a space where I'm asking, for example, a volunteer to give their time, perhaps the ways in which their time is valued is different from how I value my time, right? I don't have any dependents. I am able to operate in a more flexible time scale, but I work with people who have 2 hours from 6 a.m. to 8 a.m. to get their shit done. And what does it mean when I ask them to give up that time to me? And are there other ways that we can be in a reciprocal relationship and have honest conversations about it, right? I think for me, a big part of wanting to have this conversation was often this can be a touchy subject. It can be really hard to bring this up. It can be really challenging, and you navigate a lot of that experience with others and their own personal approaches to it. So yeah, I'll stop talking there and I can share this in the chat, but I would be curious how this resonates with others. If there's other tools that people have experienced or come across that have been a compass or a guide as we grapple with the paradoxes that we spent time talking about. If this doesn't work for you, if you're like, well, this is not how I want to think about wealth or capital, would love to also hear criticism. So I'll give it back to the group and I can share this in the chat as well.
Yeah, Esther, I think those like multi-capital models are like really interesting because it helps shine a light on the fact that money is just a form of financial capital, and there are all these other types of capital that we should somehow, invest in or measure or whatever, and we don't really have any systems for that. And then my other observation on those multi-capital models that I always think of is, and this gets back down to the paradox thing, I think, which is that because everything is super entangled with everything else, it's nice to think that money is just this like register of financial capital, but we sort of know that if you don't have financial capital, you will suffer in the other forms of capital. You might be restricted on what kind of social capital you have or whatever. So it's hard to like disentangle them all. And the thing that makes me nervous about those systems is always that if we put everything into a capitals model, are we still going to end up being basically subservient to like financial capital? Because ultimately that's the one that dominates the current system. It's almost like you need to find ways to break out of that, but I don't know what the answer to that is. It's just like free running thought on the capital stuff.
Handy.
Like natural capital is a good example where people talk about, if we start to measure natural capital, then our problems will be fixed. But I guess there's always the suspicion that, well, if you measure natural capital, then it's just going to become another number in a system that wants to extract or balance, or like, is it actually going to change the sort of fundamental problems that we have trying to get to regeneration and stuff? But, yeah.
Mm-hmm.
I wonder, Andy, whether the problem is defining these things as capital, because I suppose the definition of it is probably very different from one person to the next. Because if anyone talks to me about capital, I think of that as being a descriptor of something which I have that has intrinsic value to trade. It's got this like very specific vehicular kind of mode to it. It's not something which it is just like it's just a thing that has meaning, perhaps, or has a different purpose. It's always on the basis of that I have this thing in order to be able to trade it for something else with someone else, where they have, like in your example there, Esther, which it is so right. Everyone values things in very different ways, and so, but the emphasis is still the fact that this entire model that we've just looked at is all based on, if I have this, can I exchange it for something else? And your example was a brilliant reference to that.
Thank you both, Andys, for really valuable and interesting contribution.
There's a I don't know whether it necessarily classifies as a paradox or not, but in Norway there's this concept which is still kind of exists, which is called dugnad, which is basically the people in the community get together to help one another with the things that need to be done. So if you've got someone where like they've got holes in their roof, there's a period of time, and it's normally sort of like around spring when everyone starts doing the stuff, where you just do it. You don't do it because you expect something back. You do it because it's the right thing to do, and it's about supporting and helping the community thing, which I've always found as like quite a beautiful thing. There's no expectation in that, or like no explicit expectation, shall we say, that gets returned. It gets reciprocated just because that's being good. And it's not necessarily a case of that someone's doing it because they're a roofer. So there's an expectation that because their trade is roofing, that they'll fix the roof. It could be anyone that does it.
I think that this also, oh, sorry.
No, go on. You're meeting.
No, I think one thing that made me think of Andy is, I mean, right, we have a resilient wealth framework, and a lot of this is, I understand, a big system shift, but when we don't quite yet get ourselves to scale, how are we also seeing it in our own lives? But this resilient wealth framework, but at the foundation of it, right, is trust, it's community building, and I think your example shows that, right? There's for example, my dad is a faith leader in our community, and he doesn't have a lot of time. He's also puts up curtains in people's houses. He's a dad. He is a musician. He has a lot going on, but his time is one of the most valuable things that he gives to our community when they need it, and that can be when they're grappling with death, when they're grappling with new life, when they're grappling with big questions. And the reason he is willing and interested in doing that is in service of something that he feels a sense of belonging in, and that he's built trust in, and that there is a community. And sometimes he doesn't want to do it. Like I called him the other day. He's like, sometimes it's really hard for me to feel empathy, and it's really difficult for me to step into these conversations. But I understand the value of that human exchange that we have. And I think that then when you have fabrics like that, I mean, that's a very extreme example, of course, and we're not also lucky to live in a small town where you can drive and chat with someone next door. But when we start to build that fabric in our own lives, the resilient wealth model becomes a lot more conceivable, and also moves away from a strict valuing of each form of capital. Because I was thinking about what you were saying, Andy, right? Like we're trying to add a number to nature, and we just haven't been able to do it. And a real question is, why are we trying to? That's like actually kind of crazy that we're trying to add value to this abundant thing, as you said. But I actually have a bit of value in my mind about the nature that I am sitting in, right? I contribute to a community garden, and I'm not selling my harvest, but I'm exchanging it with friends who maybe I don't really have the money to go get a coffee, so I ask them to come and meet me in my garden, and that's where we can have an exchange of ideas or have a conversation, and it's something that's nurturing to them in the same way that maybe having a coffee might have been. So I've added that value, and I've made that choice, and it's because I've built some of that foundational fabric weaving, and I think a lot of the work that we are doing is in weaving that fabric, but then sometimes it can be easy to forget, right? How do we then start to add these layers back so that people feel valued and they don't feel extracted in systems where we're trying to weave a more regenerative, reciprocal, abundant space? Sorry, I just spoke for too long. I'm cognizant that we only have a few minutes left, so I'd also love to invite any burning thoughts. Our chat has it's been on fire. I have not caught up with a lot of things, so if there's anything that's been dropped into the chat that feels really resonant and perhaps like wisdom that can be shared for others to take with them, I'd really invite you to maybe speak it aloud if you feel comfortable.
And maybe I just could speak to the idea of that community spirit, which I thought was so interesting, because I think we've gotten so used to the fact that every kind of act of service is a service you provide. Like it has been kind of monetized in some way. So even if, you think of like the library of things, for example, that's encouraging a way where you can borrow, for example, a drill. I mean, heaven forfend, you would borrow it for a neighbor, but that's fine. That's a good step towards the right direction. But the fact that if you want to repair something, a whole marketplace has been built around that, where you exchange money for that, versus before you could ask people and it was like a pro-social thing. So I think the atomization of acts of service towards being a service that you provide and are paid for is something that's fundamentally changed our relationality to each other. And I'd be really intrigued about reintroducing that concept back in again, because we're primed for that. We're primed for support networks, we're primed for offering our services. And the second thing, we like to be useful. We like to be in place and time where our skills are needed. So sometimes that is providing monetary value, because we live in a system that requires that of us in order to buy things, basic things. But there's a massive value on top of that of just being useful and having your skills needed. So can we speak to what, that feeling, perhaps, maybe you can't put a number on it, when someone says, you have something, are you willing to help me? And you get to say yes to that. I think that's very enriching as well of how we relate to one another.
Beautifully put. Any of the last running thought? Sometimes we carry over, so also I'll stick around for another 10-ish minutes if there's any. Before I wrap us up with a quick checkout, I just wanted to thank you all and thank Martin for being here. It felt almost impossible to think about how to have this conversation in an hour. And it still feels a little impossible, but I hope that you can step away maybe with some interesting questions or provocations, or at least some drive to have these conversations in your communities, right? I think for me, this reinforced how important it is to speak out loud some of this, and that there are many, many ways and approaches. I know I have to figure out maybe how we can capture our chat. I feel like there was a lot of wisdom shared there. As a last checkout, and maybe we can just do it as a quick round of words, because I'd love to hear voices. What is something that you have exchanged or look forward to exchanging later today that isn't money in your lives? I can model us. I've offered to cook dinner for a friend who is hosting me tonight, so I'm hopefully trying to exchange some of my poor cooking skills for a place to sleep. And you can pop when you're ready, or pop it in the chat.
I used my overabundance of work to find someone else a role by creating a space for them.
I'm. Oh,
Go, Chris.
go on, John. No, you go, John, first.
I am in Orkney, and I'm sending someone a selection of various different links around community building in exchange for her possibly doing a future Steps Collective around the community energy charity she works for.
I am on my way to see family, and gathering around the world, celebrating a memory of someone, and so we'll be exchanging stories and attention and mutual care, reminded to be message.
I am taking part in Vedic meditation training this weekend in exchange for editing some affirmations that these meditation teachers would like to record, and they don't know how to use the tools. So I'm going to do this technical bits for them in exchange for learning more about this practice that I know is going to support me in lots of ways going forward.
I am looking forward to exchanging laughter this weekend, because I think laughter, when it's done right, is the ultimate non-zero-sum game.
Thank you all. I know there are a few exchanges also in the chat, so get some inspiration there. For anybody who hasn't spoken, I'll take 2 beats in case you want to. Thank you. Thank you. This has been a super pleasure. I'll try to find a way, maybe with Andy or John, to understand how the chat could be translated at least into something that we could share in our steps chat. To be aware, we'll have another session next month on citizenship. And I think that our conversation around money, citizenship, and hopefully we'll also have a conversation around participation later in the summer, are nice and interesting ways to think about that exchange that isn't always monetized. No, of course, taxes. It's tax season, so we're in the world of citizenship monetized. But yeah. And I'll stick around in case any questions come up, or if you want to share anything directly with me, and I can find a way to share it with the rest of the group. And otherwise, thank you, Martin. Thank you, Steps. Thank you, everyone. I hope you have a lovely rest of your days. To be continued.
Enjoy